Hey guys, it's heyybritny and welcome to my channel. In this episode, we're going to be covering Marjorie Taylor Greene and her interview with Megyn Kelly. So I don't really watch a whole lot of Megyn Kelly's content, but I have seen clips here and there. And I also don't know much about MTG. She did come on my radar with the whole bad built butch body comment from Jasmine Crockett regarding some dispute that she was having with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And there's definitely a lot of alliteration in that comment that Jasmine made, so I can't even say it super fast or anything like that, but this was a comment or interaction that caught a lot of public attention and it went viral. And obviously people are laughing at what she said and then making body shaming type of comments and all of this stuff, and so I definitely think that that's an interesting comment to make in the culture of BBLs and stripper culture, where there's this obsession with your body looking a specific and certain way. Now, being that I don't know much about MTG, I did want to at least do a little bit of research about her. I know that in this interview they talked about comments or statements that she got backlash for in relation to school shootings, so I did want to look and see what I could find about what she said and all of that stuff. For the most part, what I did see was that there's video footage of her talking to one of the survivors of a school shooting, and she was basically asking him like a bunch of questions, and it just didn't look good, and so she has gotten backlash for saying that the school shootings were false flags. Now that we've got that covered, I do want to say that I loved MTG's energy in this interview, especially after watching Amanda Seales debating the 20 Black conservatives. I know that I said that I really loved her energy, and I do, but I also understand that she was rude and she could have acted better towards the other contestants and how she treated them, and so it was very refreshing to have this interview between two women that was for the most part very polite, very in sync. They kind of bounced off of each other and were able to continue the conversation naturally, and you can see the kind of difference in the two women in terms of their communication style. Marjorie Taylor Greene was a little bit more reserved and polite and really just put together, whereas Megyn Kelly, not that she wasn't put together, but she was more direct in what she was saying, and she was kind of, I wouldn't say she was more dominant than MTG, but she was just more assertive and more direct and to the point where MTG kind of wasn't taking that approach to this conversation. And so regardless of what you think of both women, I do think that MTG came off very well in this interview, just based on how she carried herself and how she communicated her points throughout this interview. And I also want to call out the fact that she really did seem like an ordinary person. I really like that she came off that way because it just made her more likable. It didn't feel like she was putting on a show. It didn't feel like she was trying to be entertaining. It just felt like she was being herself and speaking about issues that she genuinely cares about. Now, in terms of everything in the interview, I do want to play one clip that I think embodies her whole energy and spirit of this interview.
Radically and unapologetically for America, just flat out for America. I'm like, I'm sorry, we don't have time to fund what you're doing. No, we don't. You guys are doing great.
If we had the extra, totally.
Yeah.
But we don't.
We don't have the money. We don't have the money, and not only do we not have the money, the middle class is turning into the working poor.
Okay, so a lot of good moments in that short clip that we played. I really like that she's saying unapologetically, I'm going to be for America. She really wants to put Americans first and do what is best for everyone in America and young people in specific. She's also talking about how this is a class war. She says that the middle class has turned into the working class of poor people, and I think that that is extremely valid because you do have a lot of people complaining and venting their frustration with how hard it is to afford the basic things that you should be able to afford, and the middle class really has transitioned into this poor working class of people who have seemed to get further away from the American dream. And the reason why I played this clip is because throughout this interview, she really wanted to focus on being basically America first and how this affects young people, because we do want to make the world a better place for the people who are coming after us. And I really like that she kept coming back to this theme throughout this interview. Okay, so let's get into some things that they talked about. So they talked about whether or not U.S. troops should be in Ukraine. And she says that while they're having this conversation, they talked about how Americans who voted for Trump, they really did so because they didn't want to have any more foreign wars. They did not want Americans to be the people fighting in foreign wars that we really don't have a whole lot to do with. They also talked about in relation to Ukraine. Ukraine is not a part of NATO, but they are getting protections as if they were in NATO. And she's saying that because of this obligates any country in NATO to basically jump to Ukraine's defense. And right now it's largely Americans doing that because we are considered a world power. And in relation to war and the effects of war, MTG really talks about how there's veterans today who are really struggling with everything that they've went through in terms of past wars that have been fought and also with being stationed overseas. She talked about how there's 22 vets a day who are committing suicide just because of all of the struggles that they are going through. She also really hit home that America is $37 trillion in debt and we can't really afford to take care of our own people, but we are constantly helping out other countries. And I think that this in a large part comes from this idea of America being the savior for everyone else, America being a world power to the point where we have so much excess that we can help out other countries willingly and whenever needed. And I think in the past that may have been something that was very true and very easy to do. And we can see that this is not the case when Americans are struggling to live on a day-to-day basis just because of everything that is going on in the world. Moving on to the other thing that they talked about, they really spent some time talking about MTG's family background. She talked about how her family was involved in the construction business, her parents owned their own business, and she was really involved in this business. And something that she said while she was talking about her background and basically her experience with politics, she said that there was only one election that she didn't vote in, and she also talked about needing to feel inspired to vote, which is something that I can relate to. There are times when there's something that needs to be done and I'll say, hey, I need to feel inspired to do it. I need to basically not necessarily get in the mood, but I just need to feel so driven to do this thing that I have to do it and nothing is going to stop me. And so I really like that she talked about politics in that way because yes, a lot of us can vote, but we don't always understand the importance of voting. And so it may be something that we put off. And so I think I've only voted in 3 elections just because it wasn't something that I felt inspired to do or I didn't think it was a big deal and it was something that I absolutely had to do. And so now I'm getting more into politics and really wanting to learn about everything that is going on and how all of this stuff that is politically related is shaping our culture and the communities that we live in. And I think it's super important how she talked about Trump being that he is a businessman who is in real estate and land development. And she really hit home this connection between Trump and her father. Being that she grew up with a father in the construction business, she found it easy to relate to people or a person like Trump just because he has that construction background. And she also talked about the way that they talk. They kind of aren't conforming to polite society in a sense. They just say whatever's on their mind and they're not really filtering their words to appease the public or good society. And so I really do like this part of Trump, and this could be me leaning into the entertainment aspect of it, being that he was a reality star, but I do love seeing people who are witty, who have good one-liners, and are able to make you laugh while they are going about whatever it is that they are trying to accomplish. And so I think that for a lot of people who, one, are either tired of having to be polite or politically correct, they did enjoy someone like Trump who was direct and just said whatever was on his mind and didn't worry about filtering it or who he's going to offend. And one thing that I thought was interesting is that she said that she didn't buy into the controversy around Trump. And so I know that a lot of people hate Trump. They think he's a bad guy. They will point to different court cases that he's been involved in. They'll talk about business deals that fell through, him being bankrupt and all of this stuff. And so I think that all of that stuff matters, and whether or not you believe it is a personal thing. But I do think that it's interesting that you can either have people who don't buy into the controversy at all, or people who are completely into the controversy and they believe every single bad thing. Because one thing that keeps coming up in the Black community is they'll say, oh, you know, Trump is racist, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't like Black people. But then why is Trump in all of the hip hop songs? Why do we point to him as a status symbol in America, that he's what people are trying to achieve or trying to strive for in terms of Black men and the wealth that they want to accumulate for themselves? And so I think it is a little bit of a mixed message. You can't promote him in your rap song, but in the same sense, we do say that rap music is promoting degenerate behavior and it is creating and encouraging ghetto culture. So in that sense, is it really a good thing that he's being mentioned in all of these rap songs? So that is something to think about. Moving on, they also discussed MTG's experience in Congress. So she really talked about the impact of social media and how she relied on information and sources outside of mainstream media to really just figure out what was going on around her. And I think that we are understanding how important that is in today's climate. I typically do not watch the news. I get my news from Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. And so I rarely go to mainstream platforms to figure out what is going on in the world. If I read an article, it's because I want to find something in written text that confirmed what I read on Twitter or what I saw on YouTube. But for the most part, the first place that I go to find out information is not mainstream media. MTG also talked about what it was that inspired her to run for Congress, and she talked about her frustration with the Republican Party, and she was basically saying that they pushed the Russia hoax. They also said that they weren't going to do certain things and then did those things. And then she also talked about them not repealing Obamacare, which she said hurt her family. And she gave this example of how her family, because they own their business, they provide health insurance to themselves and to other employees. And she was saying, I believe, that they paid $800 a month for health insurance. And under Obamacare, that went up to $2,400 a month, which is crazy. And that really is a mortgage payment. I couldn't even afford to pay that much just in health insurance in addition to my other bills. So that is really crazy when you think about how much people are paying for healthcare. And something else that she brought up that is really interesting, because she talked about how in relation to Trump, she was frustrated, I guess, with people not protecting President Trump or not supporting him. And she felt like this was just something that I guess needed to be fixed or addressed. And I think we've seen people talking about that even today, to where they were saying that his first term didn't go well because he didn't have the right people around him. And then now they're saying it's not going well because he has the wrong people around him again. It does create this question of how people are influencing the president and how people even get into those positions. And so it is interesting to think about what happens after you get elected and who supports you, where you're getting your information from, and how you're making decisions. Also, balancing personal vendettas with wanting to do the right thing for the American people, I think that is extremely difficult. It's basically the equivalent of being a head of a household and constantly having to make decisions for your family and do the right thing for the family as a whole instead of for each individual person. And sometimes you may have to make decisions for a family member at the expense of other family members, but for the most part you are making these decisions on a much smaller scale. And so I cannot imagine being the president and having to make all of these decisions. And yes, it helps when you have a support system, but is it the right support system? And going a little bit deeper into why MTG said that she wanted to run for Congress, she realized that there's not regular people in Congress who are representing the average person. She was saying that basically there are people in Congress who are there to get rich, they're there to get money, they're there to support their own interest or somebody else's interest. And it is really nice, just based off of how she is in this interview. She really does seem like a regular, ordinary person. So it is good, in my opinion, to have someone like that in Congress who is thinking of the average person and who is really concerned with making sure that the next generation is able to survive in this world and they have something to strive for. We are all in America for the American dream, and if that's not attainable, then what are we even doing? Okay, so next up, they talked about school shootings. So I mentioned earlier in the intro that she did get a lot of backlash for how she handled conversations around school shootings. And we know that school shootings have been a big thing in America, and it just keeps getting worse, it seems. The biggest school shooting that I've heard of was Columbine, and that happened in the late 90s. And it seems like since then, we really haven't improved our relationship with guns, which is really crazy to me, because we used to have a society where everyone had a gun, and the rule of law was basically don't pull out your gun if you're not going to shoot it, that sort of thing. And so we have a culture where people are very reckless with guns, and it's the people that are the issue, not the guns themselves. I do believe that people should be able to protect themselves, but you also have a responsibility to use those guns in a responsible way, and a way that doesn't cause harm to other people unnecessarily. And one thing I found interesting is that at this portion of the interview, she was talking about how the media created a new character of her that didn't exist. And that is a little bit kind of, I guess, concerning because she does kind of give Karen energy, I guess. But I do think it is important to acknowledge that people, the media, they can create a version of you that does not exist. We've seen this happen with Nick Fuentes and with Candace Owens, and they very well can do this to anyone and make it seem like they're saying something that they're not really saying, especially if you don't have the full context. And so I would love to do a deeper dive into that and see if there's anything else that I can find there. Megyn and MTG also talked about DC and just like the environment in DC. We know that they are federalizing law enforcement in DC to clean up that area and to really reduce crime, but she was also talking about DC from a political perspective. She was talking about how the people in DC aren't honorable, they're basically lying, and they are serving different agendas, and this makes it difficult when you have the media sometimes misrepresenting conversations and all of that stuff. And so she talked about having to have her staff film, I guess, interviews that she does to capture the question that was asked and what she actually said. And I know that this is a big thing that is going on because I said in one of my other videos that I did that it was very difficult to clip content because I wanted to keep it to a certain time frame, but then I also wanted to capture the most significant part of what I wanted to show to the audience. And then I also wanted to be mindful of the context of which that comment was being said in. And so point being, it is very difficult to clip content and also keep the full context. And so you have to keep that in mind whenever you are hearing sound bites from any politician or famous person. You should always go and pursue what they actually said in full so that you understand the full context of what was discussed. Okay, going back to MTG and her experience in Congress. So she was talking about basically how she first got into Congress in 2020, and she was saying that she got into some hot water because she started articles of impeachment on Joe Biden in 2020, and then she also got in trouble for comments on social media, and she got kicked off of committees. So I would want to look more into this to see what exactly was going on during these moments and whether or not she's in the right or the wrong in these situations. Something that I really liked that she talked about was who her donors are. So we know that politicians can accept money from people that help them campaign to get them reelected. And I don't know a whole lot about this, but I really liked how she talked about her donors as being average, everyday American people. She talked about her biggest donation, I guess, being $30. So she's getting a lot of donations, smaller donations, where some people are getting really big donations and they're getting that money from one person, two person, one business or two businesses. And she's really talking about how her responsibility is to the people in her district. It's to the average, everyday American. And they have this conversation about donors, and there's basically saying that when you have people who are getting donations from big pharma, big tech, from the military industrial complex and all of that stuff, it really colors how they can carry out their duties, because they do have an allegiance in a sense to their donators, because otherwise if they go against their donators, they're not going to get money in the future. And what will they do going forward if they've burned that bridge? And they've also burned a bridge with the people in their district if they've made it obvious that they are not there to support the people in their district. The other thing that they discussed in relation to Congress was what they vote on in September. This is basically where they are passing the budget for the government on spending. And she talked about how they're basically do this in September. I think they start September 2nd from what she said, and she was basically saying that they have 15 days to vote on the remaining 10 things that they need to resolve. She said that they've already resolved 2 of those things, but basically they have 15 days to discuss the next 10 things that they need to make a decision on. And she was basically saying that this is not enough time, and so I'm thinking that if you're going there in September to do all of this, you have 4 weeks or you have 24 days, but they just have 15 days. And that really does not seem like a whole lot of time, especially if you're constantly going back and forth on what you want to do and what the best route forward is. At some point in the interview, Megyn asked Kelly about who her biggest ally was in the GOP or in Congress, and at first she didn't really name anybody, but then she named Thomas Massie. And I've heard a lot about Thomas Massie from Candace as far as her endorsing him or really backing him, but outside of it, I don't know a whole lot about him, but everyone seems to have a lot of good stuff to say about him. So I do want to do more research into him to see what else I can find out about him. I really like that she said that he's not bought and paid for, meaning he puts the American people first. And I don't know exactly the context she was saying, like what bill it was for, but she was basically talking about how he wanted to vote on some bill and he wanted it to be on the record. So he made everyone come back to the chambers, whatever, to vote on the record so that it was clear to everyone else what the decision was. And so I do think that is good when you have politicians who are like that, who are holding other people accountable and they are making those decisions public and obvious to everyone else. So you can have a full picture of what people are voting on and who is voting on what. And based on what she said about him and what Candace has said about him, I'm wondering if he's a potential presidential candidate. I don't know if he had any interest in that, but later on they do discuss who is next for the MAGA movement, who's the next leader, where does MAGA go from here. And I don't know if in terms of having a presidential person other than J.D. Vance, because he's a vice president, if Thomas Massie would be in the running. Okay, so moving on to kind of the bulk of their conversation, they really talked about lobbyists in Congress. And Megyn talked about how people have been reaching out to her to get her to go to Israel. And basically, I guess in August, there's a trip to Israel and different people get invited to it. MTG was talking about how first-year Congress people and new people in leadership are expected or asked or invited to go on this trip to Israel. And they couldn't really figure out why this was allowed to happen or why it was even happening in the first place. I know that Megyn Kelly has also mentioned this, and basically he did a kind of an episode or a video on how influencers were being invited on these all expenses paid trip to Israel, and they were trying to get other people involved and really use this as a promotional opportunity for Israel and all of that stuff. And so I don't know a whole lot about it, but I did find this conversation around Israel in this interview very interesting. And getting back to what Megyn was saying about being invited to go to Israel, she was making it very clear that she shut that down. She did not want to go, but she also clarified that she did the same thing when Trump asked her to go to Mar-a-Lago. She really wanted to, she said no, and she really wanted to make sure that her audience knew that they could trust her. And so she doesn't take decisions like that lightly. She really wants to make sure that her viewers, her audience knows that she's not bought and paid for, and that she does have the freedom to speak her mind on the different issues that come up. And in this interview, I really like that MTG clarified that basically every country has an ambassador. They send people to Washington to lobby or to advocate for their country, which typically makes sense. We are a world power. Other countries should be wanting to work with us to advocate for their countries and form a relationship and all of that good stuff. But what she pointed out is that we have an act called FARA, and this is basically where you have to register if you are lobbying on behalf of a foreign nation. And she was saying that Israel is the exception to it. And I know that Candace brought this up in relation to JFK. He was really trying to get Israel to do this, and then he was assassinated and all of that stuff. And so they brought up the point that people basically said that people who are advocating for Israel's interest in America, they don't have to register for FARA because they're American. And I know that this conversation has come up a lot because we've seen different people in positions of power within the government who are from other countries, and it seems like they may have dual loyalties to where they're really promoting their own home country while also being in America and benefiting from America. And I think that you can have pride in the country that you come from, but also be a proud American. However, you have to really make sure that you are focused on this country that you are living in, because you should be working in government to make things better for the American people and the people in your district. You shouldn't necessarily be worried about what is going on in your home country if your first priority is America. However, one thing I was confused by during this interview and this portion of the interview, I didn't really understand the negative implication of not registering for FARA, or I didn't understand why registering for FARA would be so harmful to Israel. And the whole point of the act is to have transparency about who's influencing who to either vote in a certain way or to advocate in a certain way for another country, how money is being spent and all of that stuff. And so I think that if you are advocating for transparency and you have someone saying, hey, no, we don't want to be transparent, that is going to cause issues. But aside from that, I couldn't really understand what the penalty is, I guess, if you choose not to register for fire and you should. And so that was an interesting part of the conversation, and I would love to know more about that. What I found super interesting in this interview is that they talked about sending $3.8 million to Israel, and I think that they do this every year. And what was interesting about this is that we basically do this so that Israel can defend itself in the Middle East, and they were really having this conversation and talking about how Israel is technically surrounded by enemies, but they do have nuclear weapons, so they are the biggest threat to the people around them. They are not necessarily in as much danger as you would think if someone was completely surrounded by their enemies. And interestingly, they talked about how Israel has a lower national debt. I think she said that they have 400 billion, whereas we have like maybe 37 trillion. And then they also have government funded healthcare and government sponsored colleges, which is very interesting because we don't have any of that in America. So it's like, if you guys are in a better shape or a position than us financially, why do we have to send you money, especially when we are struggling? And so I think that is a good point to raise, and that's a good discussion to have about how Americans are spending our money and what it is going to, and where can we save money so that we can spend more money on Americans, especially with Americans struggling on a day-to-day basis. I've heard people have the discussion about what benefit do we get in being allies with Israel, and the one thing that came up was that basically we give them money and then they buy weapons from us, and MTG pointed out that that may not be the case. She was saying that they have a exception to where they can buy weapons from their own people, from their own military, that sort of thing. And so I don't know a whole lot about that, but I do think that it is interesting because I don't really understand why you're giving someone money to, well, I guess in a sense you're getting the money back. If you're giving them the money and then they're buying something from you, you're getting the money back. But then if what MTG is saying is correct, you're not actually getting the money back, and then you still have the weapons and all of that stuff. And so that definitely is interesting. So I don't know why that's the setup, but this was something that I would be curious to learn more about. The other part of the interview that really caught my attention was MTG's focus on America and young people in particular. And she also was really big on talking about the American standard of living. And this is where we have that clip that I played earlier happening, where she basically talked about the middle class is turning into the poor working class. This is a very accurate description of our communities because we do have people who are living pretty decently. They are middle class, but we do have a lot of people who are struggling to pay the bills. They live paycheck to paycheck and they can't really get ahead. And they played this TikTok video of a woman who is explaining this situation and saying how difficult it was for her, and she feels like she's drowning. And so when you have conversations like that out there on social media, and then you're trying to figure out how we're spending our money, where it's going, and who we are providing for, it does create a sense of frustration that we have so much money to spend, but we're not spending it on American people to make the American dream possible for everyone who is living here. It was really crazy to learn about what people are taxed for. You're taxed property tax, there's a death tax, there's an inheritance tax, there's a gas tax, and all of this stuff sounds really crazy. And this goes back to my point that I made in my other video about colonization. Like, yes, the car is a great technological advancement, but if you're used to riding a bike, if you're used to walking, the car doesn't seem that great depending on what your financial situation is. And so it's crazy that we spend so much money to survive, which is our human right, simply based on the fact that we were born. And so to pay so much money to live here, and yes, I understand that we need to pay tax to help fund different things, but it's just crazy how much we pay and how much comes out of your paycheck. And especially when you are living paycheck to paycheck, every dollar helps. And so when you are spending money and you don't quite know where it's going, that is very difficult and frustrating. And on top of that, MTG was saying that we pay $1.7 trillion in interest based off of the national debt, which is $37 trillion. And that is really crazy. Like, if you've dealt with credit cards, you know how hard it can be to pay off your credit card, because if you have a huge balance up there and you're just paying off the minimum amount each month, that number really doesn't go down. And then you add interest on top of that, you're just going to be in debt forever. The only way to get ahead is to pay off larger chunks of money each month. So one, you can actually make a dent in what you owe, and then two, you can also address interest, which is just going to increase that debt. And so this is a very interesting conversation to have, especially if you care about where your money is going, if you are someone who is in debt and you're trying to figure out how to get out of this situation that you're in as far as living paycheck to paycheck. How can you get ahead? The next topic that they talked about was young voters, and they talked about how if young people have frustration with traditional Democrats and Republicans, they're going to turn to radicals. This is making me think of the Amanda Seales versus 20 Black conservatives conversation, because she did present herself as a radical. And so if you have people who are getting frustrated with both Democrats and Republicans, where do they go to get influence? Who are they listening to? What messaging are they receiving? And so this is when you have extreme people entering the conversation. So a lot of people didn't like what Amanda Seales was saying, was because she was very extreme. She was blaming the system, blaming white people, or not necessarily blaming white people, but she was really pointing out that the system is the problem. We need to create our own nation for Black people, that sort of thing. And then on the other end, it was people saying that we just need to take accountability for ourselves and all of that stuff. And so there was definitely a conflict there in terms of ideology and how you go about fixing the problem. And if you have people who are frustrated with the system and they don't know what to do, they are going to resort to listening to extreme people who make sense. And what you consider extreme can vary from person to person, especially if you don't hear anything on mainstream media that you agree with. You are going to listen to other sources that you think make sense. And so at that point, it's just a matter of making sure that you know your history and you know where you want to go, what you want for yourself and what you want for your community. And that helps you to understand who you should be listening to. And if you don't have that understanding, that foundational understanding, it does make it difficult for young voters to figure out who to listen to, because you can listen to someone just because they sound cool without realizing that what they're saying doesn't actually mean anything. So it is super important to have that foundational understanding of the world and of history, and then also having a value system and morals that will help you figure out what your political stance is and who you align with. Okay, moving into MTG's relationship with Trump and the Republican Party. So she was talking about, or I guess addressing concerns that she was being shunned or on the outs with the Republican Party, that sort of thing. And she clarified that she still has a great relationship with Trump. And she also talked about how she is very supportive of Trump, but she can also go against or criticize something if she feels that she has a different belief or a different stance than Trump has. And she gave a few examples of this, and she said that she voted against the Genius Act, and basically she was saying that this was a act that had a backdoor for a central bank digital currency. And I think I've been seeing something like that online, where they want to create a new type of cryptocurrency or something like that and make it, like, I guess, the standard for America. And I don't know how I feel about crypto and digital currency. Like, I use my bank account like a traditional bank account, and I always get kind of like tripped out about how you can have cash and then you can see a number when you log into your account, and obviously that number represents what you're supposed to have in your account. The bank doesn't actually have all of that money in the bank under your name, that sort of thing. And so for some people, I think maybe if you have a certain amount or something like that, you can actually go and take all of your money out, because that would just create problems, right? And so it always trips me out because I don't really carry cash around with me, and I always use like my phone to pay and all of that stuff. So I could more easily, I guess, fit into digital currency and all of that stuff. But it also does make money kind of seem meaningless, or like it doesn't really exist, because you're just really seeing numbers on a screen. Anyway, that's a really weird thing. And so I can understand kind of like the hesitancy with moving to cryptocurrency or digital currency, but I also feel like we're taking baby steps there to where we're going to get there eventually, to where everyone no longer uses cash or anything like that and that sort of thing. And so I can see why people would be concerned about that. And I don't know everything in relation to having like a central banking digital currency, but I think that is definitely worth a discussion. And it also kind of goes back to that AI thing, where they had some bill where they wanted to do a bunch of stuff with AI, but states couldn't, I guess, reject it or appeal it or something like that. And there was language written in the bill that said that. And so that became problematic. And so I do think it is important for people in Congress to vote no against things, especially if they don't know the long-term implication, or if there is something in these bills that prevent you from taking action right away if you see that something is harmful. And she also clarified that she stood against Trump when it came to bombing Iran. She also talked about she wasn't for Israel bombing Gaza. She said that this is a genocide and people are starving to death and this is not anything that she agrees with. And then she also stood against Dr. Fauci, and she said that Megyn clarified that she wouldn't address him as doctor because she felt like what he was doing was a abuse of his medical position. And then she also talked about how he is currently getting taxpayer-funded pensions for whatever he has done. And so she's just given examples of things that she stood against Trump on. And I think it's fair. You should be able to support someone but also criticize them when they are doing something that you disagree with. You shouldn't have this blind loyalty to them. It's not a cult. You should be able to check someone when you feel like they are doing something that you don't agree with. Moving on to the other thing they discussed, they really talked about propaganda, and they were talking about the two different wars. They were talking about Ukraine and Russia and also Israel and Gaza, and they were talking about how basically you're seeing more images and pictures coming out of the Israel and Gaza war and how you're just seeing all of the effects on the people in that region, how people are starving. They talked about how Hamas was to blame because they are the ones who are basically robbing the food truck and preventing people from getting access to food. But then they also talked about how you're not really seeing these same images coming out from the Ukraine and Russian war. And so they were just really saying like, hey, why is this happening? Why are the situations very different in terms of what you're seeing as far as the effect? And then they also talked about whether or not the images are real. And I think, yes, you can question how things are being presented to the public as far as making you try to side with one side or the other, but you can also have a moral foundation or a moral grounding that allows you to be able to make a decision about something without necessarily having to be influenced to think one way or the other. So if you believe that killing people is wrong, then you would naturally take a certain stance in this particular situation. Or if you think that women and children shouldn't be harmed, you would naturally take a certain stance because of that positioning. And so I think, yes, you have to be careful with propaganda. You also need to be able to rely on your morals and your value system to help guide you through those situations, especially if you can't believe everything that you read or you see. Okay, so moving on to the next topic. So they talked about what happened to the Republican Party, what happened to MAGA when Trump is gone. And so they really talked about the influence of Trump. They talked about how he is this big personality. He had a lot of connections. They talked about how he had a lot of connections pre-joining politics, and they really just talked about how he's influential and is able to do all of this stuff because he is an outsider, he is outside the system, and he's able to work against it because he knows the system so well. They also talked about how there's different levels to MAGA. There's the hardcore followers, there's people who are newly adopting MAGA, and then there's people who are kind of trying to figure out if they're MAHA or something else. And so basically what they were saying is that when Trump is done with his 4 years, they think that the new people who kind of jumped onto the MAGA movement, those are going to fall off, and they're going to have to figure out who their next candidate is that they support. And then she wasn't really sure, or at least I didn't hear what she said about the hardcore people. And then she did say that she thought J.D. Vance was the next candidate, I guess, from the Republican Party. And I think that makes sense, being that he is the current vice president. And I don't know if there's anyone else out there from the Republican Party who would be a strong candidate or strong opposition to J.D. Vance. However, they did raise the question about J.D. Vance. Will he be stained by this administration? Especially because it seems like a lot of people are unhappy with Trump now because they feel like he's going against what he was voted into office for, which is no involvement in foreign wars. And so I am curious on how this is going to play out. And again, if there's going to be a better candidate who can oppose J.D. Vance. And just going back to Trump, one of the things that they talked about as far as his influence, they talked about how he is this type of person who really just does not care if he offends you or does not care to be politically correct. And I don't know if we'll see another candidate who has that same lack of filter to where they just tell it like it is and they're just honest and straightforward. However, I know that people do say that they believe Trump lies a lot and he doesn't tell the truth and all of that stuff. And so I think that you can appreciate the directness while also still calling out that he should be more accountable for what he says and he should speak the truth no matter what the situation is, to make it easier to trust him and believe in him when he says that he's going to do something or not do something. So I think that that is super important, that you have a politician that you can trust and that you can know that they are going to follow through and stick to their beliefs. You know, you don't want to be in a position where you vote somebody into office and then they just completely turn on you and they don't follow out on anything that they were put in office to accomplish. And moving on to the next point, they talked about MTG's relationship with Jasmine Crockett. Obviously, you should know about the viral moment with the bad built butch body comment, and that was just a crazy moment. And so here they're talking about their relationship. There was a recent article that came out basically bashing Jasmine Crockett and saying that she doesn't treat her staff well and all of this stuff. And so MTG kind of reiterated those claims and she confirmed them in this interview. And basically she was just saying that she's difficult to work with and all of that stuff and that she's a fraud. And so I don't really know, I obviously don't know Jasmine. I can only go off of what I see in the public. And she kind of fits into the energy that Amanda Seales had, especially in the debate that she did with the 20 Black conservatives. When you think of people in politics or in Congress or in government, you think of people who are very serious and very stern and very no nonsense. And I do think that you need to have people who have a lighter side to them. They can kind of tap into pop culture and they have that youthful energy to them, but you also don't want someone who's unserious to where nobody takes them serious and they're just good for buzzwords and catchphrases and all that stuff. And so it was definitely interesting to see how they're talking about Jasmine Crockett. And I don't know a whole lot about her, but I know that she gets a lot of flack for saying that she's of Black America, she represents the people, she's from the hood, whatever. And then they talk about how she's gone to private schools. I went to private schools, and I don't think that just because you went to private school or you had a nice middle class or upper class life, that doesn't mean that you don't know what it's like to be a Black American. You may have less experience with racism or any kind of negative experience with people because of your race, but those things are always going to be there, especially if you're interacting with different people. And you can even argue that if you are someone who has wealth and you are interacting with other people who have wealth and those people are not Black, they may perceive you a certain way because you typically would not be in their circle. So you can experience just as much racism if you are someone who goes to a private school or if you live in a really nice neighborhood. People may think you don't belong there just because of your skin color and all of that stuff. So I think there is two sides to the argument here. Yes, you can say she doesn't live the typical everyday experience that Black people do. She would still have some experiences with racism and all of that stuff. I just don't like the whole Baps energy. And if you know the movie Baps, that was the Halle Berry movie where they were basically very ghetto and they were working for this rich white man who ended up leaving him a lot of money just because they helped turn his life around or make his life a little bit happier and all of that stuff. And so he does kind of tap into that energy a little bit, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. There's just a time and place for it, and it may not always be when you are doing your job representing Congress and representing your district. And so again, I don't know a whole lot about her, but I'm just going off of what I've seen on social media. But you also want to keep in mind that there are a ton of clips out there that make people look bad, and you need to know the full context of what is being said before you judge people. And so I do want to close with that message. Alrighty, so to wrap up this episode, I'm very glad that I watched this interview with MTG and Megyn Kelly. I wasn't sure what to expect, and this was very surprisingly a pleasant interview, and I enjoyed all of the good stuff that I learned, and there's definitely stuff that I want to research a little bit more just to see exactly what they were talking about and to get those little details that I think will help me in my understanding of politics and all of this stuff. And so I'm really interested in expanding the people that I watch in terms of politics and who I learn from, because I really do want to be well-rounded in my political views and how I think about the world and the social commentary that I provide. I don't know if I'm going to go down the rabbit hole and just watch a bunch of her videos or anything like that, but I am interested in learning more about different political figures, where they stand and what impact they have on the community. So yeah, let me know what you thought about this interview. Let me know what you think about my comments in this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.